Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 23rd of September Overberg presentation by Bruce Sidney Rubidge. Welcome, Bruce. We're really looking forward to this presentation. And Bruce said to me, please keep it short, his introduction, so I'm going to keep it short. Bruce is the director of the Department of Science and Technology, National Research Foundation Centre of Excellence for Paleosciences. He completed his BSc Honours Cum Laude at Stellenbosch University, took up a curatorial position at the Karoo Paleontological Department, National Museum in Bloemfontein in 1980, becoming the head in 1982, and then was appointed director of the Bernard Price Institute and head of the paleontology department at the University of Wits subsequently. He has a broad research interest, as he said, in focusing on the remarkable fossil record of the Karoo and the significance of the understanding of these mammals and all they mean for evolution, climate change, paleontology, and understanding our sort of record of the Earth. He's also passionate to expose the paleoheritage of South Africa, and this is where he has really made a significant contribution. He was instrumental in setting up the Paleo Science Museum at Wits, which forms the core of an active outreach program. He's been involved with the development of the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site, the Golden Gate Dinosaur Exhibition Centre, and setting up the Kitching Fossil Exploration Centre in Nueva Bacida as a sustainable paleotourism business which employs local people from the town. And he's back in Graaff-Reinet, and I guess in the course of this presentation, at the end, he'll tell us why he's back there in sort of his hometown and back in the area he knows best. Thanks, Bruce. Over to you.
Thanks, John, for that introduction. I really just want to share some ideas with you with research that I've done over the last 40 years, and I've entitled this Tribulations, the Earliest Colonization of Land in Gondwana, because, as you will see, the South African record is the only record that covers that time period in the world. But I thought I would just start this talk by giving you an introduction to the immense importance of the paleontological record of South Africa. If you go back in time to 3.5 billion years ago, we've got the earliest evidence of life on Earth. And then in subsequently younger rocks, we've got younger and younger forms, but here at about 700 million years, we've got some of the earliest evidence of multi-celled life known in the world. And then in the Cape supergroup here, 500 million years to 350 million years, we're now unearthing a remarkable history of fish origins, some of the earliest fish in the world, and also the earliest tetrapod, the earliest amphibian type animal, which is being worked on by Rob Guess from Albany Museum in Grahamstown. And then the Karoo has just got an amazing record of the origin of reptiles from 300 million years onwards to 180 million years. Then with the breakup of Gondwana, there's not much of a record, but there are odd little places where you pick up the story. But what South Africa also has is a remarkable history of human origins and also human cultural development and technological development. There is no other single country in the world that has all of this story. So it's something that I think that all South Africans can be rightfully very proud of. Also, when we look at extinction events, in the last 500 million years, there have been 5 major extinction events when anything between 60% and 90% of the species have gone extinct in a relatively short time period. And we've got a very good record of the end Devonian extinction, probably the best record in the world of the end Permian extinction on land. The end Triassic extinction is being exposed in the terrestrial realm in Stormberg at the moment by Jonah Schwannier at Wits University and Imesha Bodi from UCT. And then we've got an offshore record of the end Cretaceous. So of the 5 major extinction events, 4 of them at least are represented in South Africa, and maybe the Indo-Division one will come up also in the future. But what we're going to be talking about now is the Karoo supergroup, which is important from a paleontological aspect because it covers a very long time period. The earliest deposition of rocks of 300 million years for the Dwight group, and then going through to 180 million years for these basalts over here. So we've got an almost continuous record of the development of life from 300 million years ago to 180 million years ago. And what is important about that is that 300 million years ago, just a little bit more than 300 million years ago, reptiles first appeared on Earth. And then they diversified into two main lines. One line giving rise to dinosaurs, lizards and snakes and birds, and tortoises are now included in that line. That's the line that has two openings behind the eye. And then the other line, which is particularly important for the Karoo, is that line which has only one opening in the skull behind the eye. And that's the line that led right towards mammals. And it's the therapsid record, the mammal-like reptiles of South Africa, that are particularly important and for which South Africa is noted. And were first brought to attention by Andrew Geddes Bain when he was building the road from Grahamstown to Fort Beaufort, Queen's Road, and he discovered these animals, which he sent to Richard Owen at the Natural History Museum in London, called the British Museum at that time. And Owen then described these as a new order of animals. But it was really Robert Broom, who came here in 1897, that put the stamp on the therapsid, the mammal-like reptiles of South Africa. And he wrote in 1932, in this thick book that he wrote on the mammal-like reptiles of South Africa, he said the mammal-like reptiles of South Africa may be safely regarded as the most important fossil animals ever discovered. And their importance lies chiefly in the fact that there is little or no doubt that among them we have the ancestors of mammals and the remote ancestors of man. Well, that is still very true today. And we've got lots of different types of these mammal-like reptiles. Here's just a little sample of skulls and skeletons of these early mammal-like reptiles. But what is important, and something which Broom never lived to see, was the discovery of some of the earliest mammals in the world. In the Stormberg group of rocks, in the Elliott Formation. You could see this is the little skull of this animal. It's not very big. The skull is the length of my first digit of my thumb. So the total animal length is about the length of my thumb. You could see there's his eye over there, or the teeth over there, the nose in the front here, and there's the brain case over there. So a tiny little animal, but this is one of the oldest mammals in the world. And certainly the person that found the most fossils in the Karoo was James Kitching, who worked at Wits University from 1945 until he retired in 1990. That's when he retired, and then he continued to work on afterwards. So he worked there for more than 50 years. And in that time, he collected thousands of fossils in the Karoo. If you were to add together the number of nights in his diary that he lived in a tent in the Karoo, it works out to 23 years of nights in the Karoo. And this is the biozone map which he published after he's collecting things in the Karoo. This was before he started working on the Stormberg. So this was in his thesis in 1977. So what we're going to be talking about is this lowermost zone over here, which has changed since then. And you could see this more recent map. It's now a bigger area. It's called the Tappan-Kefla zone, and it's this yellow area down here. And the person who worked extensively on that was Boonstra, who worked at the South African Museum from I think it was 1927 until 1971, so also for more than 50 years. And he worked on the earliest mammal-like reptiles, these ones that occur at the bottom. Now, the mammal-like reptiles comprise lots of different types of animals there. Dicynodonts, you might want to just remember some of these names because it will make it easier to follow. Dicynodonts, Dynacathalians, Therocathalians, Gorgonopsians, but it's this green line up here that gave rise to mammals ultimately. And so what we're going to be talking about today is this area over here with the very origins of mammal-like reptiles. And the story began with Boonstra in the Karoo. And Boonstra created these wonderful dioramas at the South African Museum. They've been recently broken down, but very excitedly, see that they're on the South African Museum website, and there's a sort of almost a three-dimension rendition of them, and they are beautiful. So they're worth looking at, and will take Boonstra's creativity into the future. But Boonstra, in 1969, just shortly before he retired, he published a very extensive publication called The Fauna of the Tapinacephalus Zone. And he said that these animals had this sort of biostratigraphic distribution. As you can see, it's not very detailed. So he was talking about this zone over here, the yellow zone, the Tapinacephalus zone. Now, I saw that John Truswell came in and registered, and one of the contentious boundaries in the Karoo is the nature of the Eka-Beaufort boundary. It's always been a matter of debate in earlier publications in the Karoo. The other boundaries between the different groups and formations in the Karoo are reasonably well defined, but the Eka-Beaufort boundary was not well defined. And we were always told at university, our professors said to us that one of the differences between the Eka and the Beaufort is the Beaufort has fossils of reptiles in it, and they are absent in the Eka apart from Mesosaurus, which is that swimming reptile found in the Whitehill Formation. So fossils are absent in the Beaufort. Fortuitously, Roy Oosthuizen, who farmed down at Prince Albert, never went to university, so he didn't have any professors to tell him where there weren't fossils. So on his farm, in rocks then mapped as Eka, he found this skull. It's not a very well-preserved skull, but the eye is over there, the brain case is here, there's a bit of a tooth socket over there, and this was described as a new species of animal, and in fact considered the most primitive dicynodont by Tom Barry, who was then the director of the South African Museum in Cape Town, and he called it Eodicynodon oosthuizeni after Roy Oosthuizen, who discovered that specimen. In 1972 is when Barry described it first. And then in 1979, I was an honours student at Wits University, and I, for the first time, met Roy Oosthuizen. And sorry, I wasn't at Wits, I was at Stellenbosch University, and I met Roy Oosthuizen, who was the farmer at Prince Albert, and he suggested to Burger Olofsen, who was then my supervisor, that I do a project on the Eka-Beaufort boundary near his farm at Prince Albert, this area down here in the basin. Now, Roy was a very enthusiastic person, and on my very first day out into the field there, he retained me at his house because he just wanted to talk about fossils and I wanted to get out. So I had to change the whole program that I'd set for myself that day. So I then drove into a windmill at the middle, in the middle of this one farm called Moorderdrift, and I walked 100 yards and I found this skull. And this skull really changed my life and created a research career for me. You can see the eye. It's a very large skull. That's a 30-centimeter ruler. The eye over there, teeth over here. And I didn't really know what it was. I could see it was an animal with big teeth, and I thought it was probably a Dynacathalian. Well, it later turned out to be a new species of Dynacathalian, and we then discovered more complete skeletons of it, and this is the most complete skeleton that we've discovered. And there's my colleague, John Naipuli, who worked with me at the National Museum. He and James Kitching were probably, at that stage, the best fossil collectors in the Karoo. He just had an amazing eye for finding fossils. And between John and I, in these rocks, in what was mapped then as Eka, we found a whole new fauna of animals. All of these things were new species that were found by John and I. And this one here, this Dynacathalian, is a really exciting discovery because it's the most complete Dynacathalian skeleton yet discovered. And you can see it's a large animal, 3 meters long. It took us about 2 years to excavate in the field, and then a further 23 years to prepare in the laboratory at Wits to expose these different bones. But it has from the first neck vertebra right down to the tail vertebra over there. So it's wonderfully complete. And we then published on it. More recently, we published another paper, trying to work out what this animal would have weighed. I worked with my postdoc, Marco Romano, and we estimated that this animal would have weighed about a ton. So on the basis of all of those fossils, we established a new biozone at the base of the Beaufort group over here, which we called the Eodicynodon zone. And then my horizons changed, because then I needed to see what was happening, how this biozone connected in with other biozones. At much the same time, I got in touch. Martin David introduced me to Sam Bowring from MIT, who was noted for his very good TIMS dates that he produced for volcanic ashes. And so, together with Sam Bowring from MIT and Doug Irwin from the Smithsonian Institute, we started collecting ashes from all the different vertebrate biozones. And we were able to then get ashes, datable ashes, for the with TIMS dates for most of the biozones except the yellow zone, and we will talk about that later because we've got more dates for that. I used to just send the ashes out to Sam. Sam dated them, and fortuitously the dates came back in the right order, and we didn't have to throw away any others that were not telling our story. So I'm very happy with these dates, and they fit in with our international correlations of fossils. Well, you in the Western Cape will all recognize Saki Rist. He was the supervisor of my PhD, and here he is with Cameron Penn Clark, who's also in the Western Cape and is now the other Cape supergroup worker, very much inspired by Saki. And Saki always said to me when he was my supervisor, he was an amazing supervisor because he asked the most incisive questions, and he kept saying to me, yes, you're working on this Eka-Beaufort contact, but where is the shoreline? And so I worked on trying to find the shoreline. And I think that we found a very good definition for the Beaufort-Eka contact. We've got characteristics, we've published characteristics of the upper Eka and how it changes to the Beaufort. And this is what it would have looked like. These delta distributaries, and the beginning of land would have been the beginning of deposition, Beaufort group, and from that point, from the shoreline contact upwards, we start finding fossils of therapsids, of mammal-like reptiles. And that meant now I'd found this new biozone which stretched from basically from Laingsburg to Rietbron, and now I needed to work upwards to see how it connected with Boonstra's biozones. So my horizons changed completely, they broadened, and fortuitously, with the uranium rush in the 1970s, remember I'm a post-1970 person, so with the uranium rush in the 1970s, the scientists then, the geologists then, were able to define various arenaceous packages, which they then gave names like Cormorant, Kraal, Purenplast, Moordenaars, and Puertjie members, which will be known to all of you geologists who worked in the Karoo. But we had no idea of how the ranges of the fossils correlated with these. And so with my expanded vision, I then got lots of people involved in this project. There you can see Roger Smith, in those days with black hair, John Naipuli, James Kitching, and over here, people like Johan Neefling. For the paleontologists listening, there's Tom Kemp from Oxford, Mike Day, who's now at the Natural History Museum in London, John Naipuli, Fernando Abdallah, who's in Argentina, Sifilani Giro, who's one of my current PhD students, Gabe Bever, Ken Angelsic, who's the most, really the dicynodon specialist in the world, and Juan Cisneros from Brazil. All of these people worked with me, and this was the field trip we took just before COVID locked us all down. It wasn't a striptease act. These people were just getting very hot because we had temperatures in excess of 40 every day last year. But we found lots of fossils in the process. You could see this very nice Dynacathalian skeleton over here, which we're busy excavating. And over there is a parasaur, which we're excavating. Not all of these animals died next to tarred roads. And so we've sometimes then got to carry them quite far. They require a lot of energy. And at the end of every day, we catalogue all our forms. Everybody brings forward what they have found for the day. We write up all this information, GPS coordinates, stratigraphic position, and this is our haul for one field trip. In the Dynacathalian zone, you don't find many fossils, but all of these plastic bags have got little fossils in them, and there's a larger one lying on the stretcher over there. But you cannot do biostratigraphic work if you don't know what the animals are, if the animals haven't been correctly identified and classified. And for that, we needed to revise all the previous taxonomic work done by my predecessors. And so I've had various students working on different groups. Here's Sania Neumann, Sania Guven, as she was at that stage. She worked on Dynacathalian Dynacathalians. Ashley Kruger worked for his master's on this animal over here, which is a baby of that one. It turned out to be, it was one that we discovered as a result of our field trip. This is an Anthesaurus. And Ashley then worked on how a growth series of these animals looked. And so, whereas Boonstra would have called this a different species, we now recognize that as juvenile of this over here. And so, in the process, we've been able to recognize that there are many fewer species than what our predecessors recognized. Also on the Dynacathalians, with the advent of scanning techniques, Julian Benoit, who was then one of my postdocs, he's now a member of staff at Wits University. He is a specialist on brains and nerves. And so he was able to reconstruct the brains, and looking at the semicircular canals in the middle ear over here, he was able to work out what the orientation of the skull was, and so determined that these animals were head-butting animals and used that as conflict. And so has been able to work on the biology of these Dynacathalians. On the Dicynodonts, there are lots of different types of Dicynodonts. These were all new species found by me because they're the most prominent and dominant herbivores of that middle Permian period. And I worked a lot with Ken Angelsic from the Field Museum. This is what Dicynodonts all look like. They've either got no teeth or just two tusks and a bony beak which covers their mouth over here, and they were plant eaters. But this is our family tree, our cladogram, showing the relationships of all the Dicynodonts. And most of these over here are new species discovered by us, and all of them are more primitive than anything previously discovered. So that set the motion on trying to understand the interrelationships of Dicynodonts. Fernando Abdallah from Argentina, who was also once a postdoc of mine, worked on the Theracathalians. These animals over here, they look like that in Boonstra's diorama. And then this strange group, the Biomasuchians, you can see this one with an eye over there, the lower jaw over here, teeth preserved over there, was a new species we discovered, and also this over here. And I worked together with Sean Modesto, who was also once a postdoc of mine. He's from Canada, and Chris Seedorf from the University of Washington in the United States. And then more recently, in fact, right at the moment, Eleanor Duhamel, who's a PhD student of mine, produced this paper earlier this year, showing changes that have happened in the Biomasuchians, so we can understand what babies look like and what adults look like. And then in this very extensive work on the Pariasaurs, these things are 3 meters long, they're very heavy, they're very difficult to work on. And Mark van der Brandt, who's just submitted his PhD at the end of last year, determined that from a plethora of species previously recognized, he now recognizes only 3 species in the Beaufort. And then this interesting little animal, you can see the head over there, the backbone coming down here, the expanded ribs. And I've been working extensively with Tyler Leeson and Gabe Bever in the United States. And this we consider to be the most distant ancestor of tortoises. And I think we've got a lot of evidence to point that out. One of the more exciting projects that we got involved in was this student of mine, Meryl van der Walt. She she became a GIS specialist, and I suggested to her that she took all the databases from all the museums in South Africa and put that onto a GIS system so that we could look at what fossils occur where and what species occur together and answer those sorts of paleoecological questions. And when looking down at this biozone down here, our fossils that we collected, and together with those collected by my predecessors, plotted out like this. And I then got various students to come and assist me to do sedimentological work along the Eckerberg boundary around here, to measure up stratigraphic sections around the basin, and to plot in the horizons of species as they occurred in the stratigraphic section. You must remember, this is hugely complicated work because of the folded nature of these strata over here. So you first got to unravel the folds and then plot on the fossils onto them. And resulting from that, we now have a good idea of the stratigraphic distribution of all these different species, middle Spermian species from South Africa in relation to these various sandstone packages. So for instance, when we look at the distribution, we use Merrill's database and we look at the distribution of Eodicynodon. It occurs in this area here. That's the one type of Dicynodon. If we look at Eocymops, it occurs stratigraphically slightly higher. You look at Diectodon, it occurs even higher, and Endothiodon even higher. So now we were able to plot their ranges, and because of volcanic ash dates, TIMS dates that we got from these new volcanic ashes from down here, we've been able to determine when these animals lived, and we can use this for international correlation of these strata as well. Now, because of the work of one of my postdocs, one of my PhD students, Michael Day, who you saw in a previous photo, he did a lot of work on bringing all the stratigraphic sections together, and he found that these are different families. They increased in numbers. We were trying to see if we could replicate what Boonstra had said in his distribution of the biostratigraphic distribution in the Tapinakephla zone. We weren't quite able to replicate that, but what we did pick up was that at that point, there's a whole big faunal change over there. That we've dated at 260 million years ago. And at that point, it appears that there was an 80% extinction. 80% of species went extinct on land in the Karoo at 260 million years ago. That's at the base of the Puerki member. All of these went extinct, and a couple made it through. That date, 260 million years ago, correlates with an extinction in the marine realm in China, called the Meishan extinction. It's the end Guadalupean extinction, which removed a whole lot of marine invertebrates at that time. And it appears to correlate with the Emerson volcanics at that time as well. So we published this paper pointing out this extinction event, gave it a date of 260.259 million years. But later on, we did more detailed work. Having found where this extinction occurs, we then did more detailed and refined biostratigraphic collecting, and we find that it's not a single extinction. It's actually two extinctions. There's a primary extinction, and then there's a low diversity extinction interval, and then there's a recovery of species, and then there's a secondary extinction which removed those that made it through the first extinction. And so that is something that we're currently working on and will continue for some time. We've been trying to work out what caused this extinction, and I had a postdoc by the name of Kevin Ray at that point, and he was a specialist on isotopes, bone isotopes from bone, and so he worked on tusks of this animal called Diectodon, which we collected through this interval right across this extinction event. And we found that at various localities along the Niederfeldt escarpment that there was a carbon shift at that point, at the extinction event. And this occurred at all the different localities. This happened at that point. And Kevin told us this corresponds with a massive aridification at the time, not necessarily increase in temperature, but massive aridification. So far, I've taken you around the basin, the Eka-Beaufort boundary over here, up to about that point. That's what we covered, in other words, up until the Orange River. And we'd looked at what the Eka looks like, we'd defined where the shoreline is, we'd found new species. And then I got David Chronobot in as a PhD student, and he then covered this part of the basin over here and did a remarkable job, because as you know, in the Free State and Natal, there are no good outcrops of rocks, and that's what the Eka-Beaufort contact looks like in the Free State and Natal. But David, with his diligence and looking out for fossils, was able to come up with a resolution to that. And what he found was that this lowermost biozone here extends much further northwards, but only the lower part of this biozone extends much further northwards up to Forest Smith. So beyond the Orange River, up until then, we'd only found it as far as Victoria West. Now he pulled it right up to here. And he also found that these other biozones, these ones that occur here, the purple ones, the pink ones, do not occur in this part of the basin. And so he then came up with a new basin development model for the Karoo. Now in 1998, Octavian Catanuna and John Hancox and I came up with the idea that the Karoo behaved in a reciprocal fashion. That happened in the four deep was not necessarily recorded in the distal sector of the basin at the same time. And if you look at from our collecting of fossils, the yellow zone down at the bottom over there, this is where it's distributed here in a cross section of the basin in early times at 263 million years ago. Then we go into the subsequently younger biozones, up here to the more orange ones, the Diectodon Sarcocephalus zone over there, and then upwards into the Endothiodon zone, the purple zone over there. These all occurred in the proximal part of the basin, except for the Tapinacephalus zone, the lower part of the Tapinacephalus zone, which went across into the distal part of the basin. So it showed to us that initially there was Beaufort deposition in the south. Then what happened was that Beaufort deposition, the shoreline gradually moved northwards, but then it receded and came backwards, southwards again. And then at this point here, at about 254 million years ago, we get the blue layers going right across the basin over there. And so then and moving the shoreline then further northwards. And so there with that was the migration of this shoreline gradually northwards into the basin, but it was punctuated, it moved north and south as this basin fluctuated with time. And so this was a major contribution of David's work. And so that was the ecology of the earliest land environment in Gondwana, populated by Dynacathalians such as this one, Tapinocaninus, and that was the situation in the Karoo in South Africa. But what was happening in other parts of the world at the same time? So I put together this column, stratigraphic column from different countries. This is the South African section over here, and this is the time interval that we're talking about, the yellow layers down there with the Eudicynodon and the Tapinacephalus zone down here. And then we go into Namibia. There's earlier stuff preserved there, and Roger Smith's more recently been working on that. Not found land-living animals, but found marine animals. Then Zimbabwe's got bits and pieces of it. Mozambique, nothing. Zambia, nothing. Malawi, well, Zambia now, it appears, might have bits and pieces of it. Malawi, nothing. Tanzania got a little bit. Morocco, a little bit of the earlier stuff. Russia and Brazil over there has got bits and pieces, and now with the most recent paper from Brazil, it looks as if this might come down even more, which is very exciting. And then from Russia, which is where previously all these mammal-like reptiles, early mammal-like reptiles were known from, we now find that our record is much more continuous. And apart from that, the Russian record is spread over different basins. It's not in one continuous place. There's an interesting occurrence in China, and of very primitive ones which compare with our things of South Africa, but they also have more primitive things. And so I've worked extensively with the Chinese people also. So it appears that these animals that came into the Karoo came maybe from China, somewhere around there, Russia, China, moved over into the Karoo via overland migrations. And this most recent paper from Brazil probably corroborates that as well. So what does this all mean? It means that we've discovered a new fauna of primitive reptiles in South Africa. It also means that we now have an understanding of the earliest Karoo ecosystems. We have an understanding of the Eka-Beaufort transition throughout the basin, which with David Chronobot's work, we know that it's exactly the same lithologically in the north of the basin as what it is in the south of the basin, except the upper Eka is much thinner in the north of the basin. And we've got an understanding of middle Permian vertebrate distribution now. We've got an understanding of the end Guadalupean extinction on land, and we've got an understanding of Karoo basin development, as well as a better understanding of intercontinental correlations. But as you can see, these are all big questions. We're continuing to work on them, and it is a thrust that we're gradually taking forward. But now what, apart from doing that, what do I want to do? The Karoo is really an international icon, paleontological icon, and I feel it needs to be showcased. And my grandfather in the 1930s collected a big collection of fossils. He became very interested in fossils and discovered many, many new species. In fact, he collected was responsible for finding 118 new species of animals in the Graaff-Reinet area. That collection now looks like this, and it's housed on our family farm, Wellwood. And I feel that I want to do something with this that's meaningful to the country and the community. Some really beautiful fossils. This fossil here, this photograph with my son in the background shows that he was not very pleased to be included in this photograph, but he was important for a scale. My plan is to try and establish something in Graaff-Reinet that can really showcase these fossils and that we can use to launch extensive research in the Karoo and run a paleontological field institute from here. So thank you for your attention. And I just want to end with this quote from Mike Kluwer and Tom Barry, who were the assistant director and director of the South African Museum in the 1970s, where they said South African paleontology is world paleontology, and the research workers of this country who are involved in it have an important duty to ensure that the unique heritage in their charge is never threatened by neglect, but preserved, recorded, and ultimately reconstructed to serve as the standard world guide to the extinct animals of the prehistoric past. And I just want to thank my various sponsors, past, the Department of Science and Innovation, Wits University, the NRF, and the Center of Excellence for funding this work in the past. Thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful, Bruce. So who wants to kick off with the discussion?
What has been fun on doing this project was that it was a multi-pronged project involving lots of different disciplines, not just fossils, but also geology and dating and isotopes. And now one of the really exciting developments in paleontology now is to be able to scan these fossils with high-powered CAT scanners. We can now scan these fossils. Unfortunately, it is expensive to acquire this equipment, and you can only really do quite small fossils at the moment. It's moving boundaries hugely and getting to a much greater understanding of what's happening inside skulls in areas that we couldn't get into previously.
Yeah, the TIMS dating of those ash beds and the precision is also fantastic, Bruce.
Yeah, it is. You know, it's not something I know something about. I send it to Sam Bowring, and now more recently, now that Sam has passed on, Johan Ramazani, and they send back those dates. And I think it's just wonderful that they've come out in the right order, and they're very useful now for intrabasinal correlation, and not only that, also correlating these sequences around the world.
Yeah, wonderful.
Bruce, may I ask you, the majority of the fossils that your grandfather found, where did they fit into the scenario that you've painted today?
Okay, the stuff that I'm working on is much older than what Grandpa worked on. The stuff that Grandpa worked on around Graaff-Reinet is in the regions of 255 million years old, between 252 and 255 million years old. And the stuff that I'm working on is about 260 million years old. So quite a lot older. And the youngest ones are 260. And I suspect that with our new dates that we're getting now, that we're going to find for the oldest part of that biozone will be in the regions of 266 million years. So my animals are about 10 million years older than Grandpa's animals.
Thanks, Bruce. The question that came, and just the diagram of Gondwana shows the Karoo is very much inland. When was it at the shoreline? Do you have a picture thereof? So I guess the real question is, you know, what was the Karoo Basin? Was that a very extensive inland sea?
I don't have it right available now, but if you go onto Scottisa's website, you will see that the early part of the Karoo Basin was all marine through Eka times, Dwika and into Eka times, and then it was really the beginning of the Beaufort that records the earliest terrestrial deposits, and that starts in the south with this new biozone that we've identified. That is the earliest terrestrial deposits. And then as you move northwards in the basin, as the shoreline prograded northwards, so the shoreline also became younger with time.
The Cape Mountains, the Cape Fold Mountains were progressively sort of shutting off the Karoo Basin from the open ocean, were they? I
think that the initial uplift of the Cape Fold Mountains, which I think is now in the 2016 paper, said to be at about 260 million years ago. The Cape Fold didn't shut it off from the sea. The land was north of the Cape Fold Mountains of the source area.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay.
Jenny, I just wanted to know, because the reason why you're not getting so many questions is that we cannot pronounce most of the names. John Lehman wants to know what caused the extinctions. How sure are you, and what is your take on what caused the various extinctions?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and it's not something that I'm particularly well versed on, but with all of these 5 extinctions of the past, they all seem to be linked with some sort of volcanic activity, which would probably caused climate shift. The end Permian extinction, Roger Smith has done it, and Jennifer Buerta from National Museum Bloemfontein have done extensive work on that. And they think that it was a period of aridification, which was probably a result of global climatic change. And certainly what we are picking up from our tusks on Dictodon seems to show that it was becoming drier at that time. And interestingly, I was just reading a paper of Cole and Wiplinger, where they also said from a sedimentological point of view that at that stage, which is the beginning of the Puerki sandstone, it starts getting drier.
You've just come up with something where you said there was a semi-extinction and then a final extinction. Do you think those would have been 2 different volcanic periods? Them making it through it, then finally wiping them out?
You're stretching my knowledge more than what it is. We don't know at this stage, and I don't know how this extinction took place. It's just interesting that it seemed to be a 2-phased extinction, the one that we have now defined at the end of the middle Permian, and that also occurs like that at the end of the Permian, where Roger Smith is working. So that's just an interesting correlation. We don't understand it yet. That's part of what the future holds.
Bruce, fantastic talk and very clear, very interesting, a lot of information to be garnered. And no, thanks very much for doing that. From what I understand, the end of the Karoo is also a major period. Well, we know it's a major period of volcanicity with the Stormberg basalts and so on. But it occurred just after a major period of aridification with the Clarence sandstone, as I understand it. So where do the fossils actually end in the Karoo? For example, where do the dinosaurs fit in now, and where did they come in relation to what you discussed, and what caused their extinction?
I'm going to duck out of this because it's actually the subject of next week's talk. And Jonas Schwannier is going to talk about the dinosaurs. But the dinosaurs came in at about 200 to 220 million years ago. That Triassic-Jurassic extinction is, I think, about 200 million years ago. My stuff is 260 million years ago. So Jonah next week is going to tell you about the fantastic work that he and colleagues are doing on the dinosaur faunas in the Stormberg and the extinction that's recorded there.
So in other words, you haven't encountered any dinosaurs in anything you've looked at?
That will be groundbreaking news if I were to find dinosaurs down where I work. So if we could find one, it'll be in all the news headlines tomorrow, but I haven't found it yet.
Okay.
Bruce, the fossils you found down here in the Karoo, are they only in the Karoo area, or have they spread beyond our area into other parts of the world too?
Okay, that's an interesting question. We found a certain type of little fossil at Williston, which was new to the Karoo Basin. And then about 10 years later, one of my ex-students, Juan Cisneros, discovered very much the same thing in Brazil. And we're finding similar stuff in Russia as well. So we're finding same things all over the place, yes.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, first of all, a trip down memory lane for me. Characters like Saki Rust, the fossil man.
James Kitching.
James Kitching, yes. Saki Rust and I wrote the first stratigraphic code for South Africa in the early 70s. And probably one of my few claims to fame is I was an examiner for his PhD thesis or DSc thesis on the Table Mountain sandstone. But I wanted to ask you, Bruce, is there a sort of inevitability in evolution as a whole? Did evolution have to produce birds or humans or whatever at one stage or another? No, could have gone some other way completely. Maybe it's a ridiculous question.
No, I don't think it's a ridiculous question. I think it's a question that comes across all our minds at some stage. But I think it's entirely a random thing. Those that are adapted to living in certain circumstances or in changed environments are the ones that continue to exist. So it's really just a matter of survival of the fittest. Those that are able to live in changed environments or in the environment in which they are living are the ones that are best equipped to survive. And whether their particular adaptations are taking them towards birds or taking them towards mammals is really a matter of what their characteristics are.
Hi, Bruce. It was lovely talk. Thank you again.
Hi, Laura.
I just wanted to ask, what's your timeline for the museum? Tell us a little bit more about the museum.
Laura, what I'm trying to do now is raise capital to do this, because I don't just want it to be a little tin pot show. I want it to be really good. It's got to be driven by tourism, because that's what's got to create the funding to employ a paleontologist into the future. And so it's got to take people off the highway at Beaufort West and bring them to spend an extra bed night in Grafrenet. It's got to be that sort of exhibit.
Okay.
Geotourism. And we must now start all holding hands for the various regions, the geotrails, and we form an organization that points everybody to all the key points. You know, we must all start holding hands on this as a project.
I agree. I think that's what the thing is that we need to do. And I know that Richard has been very involved, Richard and Morris previously were very involved in trying to take this sort of thing forward. And I think it's very important. And you in the Western Cape are actually quite advanced in this sort of thinking already.
Yeah, there needs to be sort of some overall, coordination. I think better coordination than there is at the moment, Bruce. Not to say that there should be groupthink or people tramp on each other's toes, but I mean, we will all be watching with great interest and supporting you, 110% with your initiatives, because it'll be, a flag post for everyone else to follow. And that's fantastic what you are doing. And equally fantastic is the amount of information in science and, the students you've educated. The important thing too is how do we get all this down to kids, kids and the lay person? Because if you look at our geological profession, if you look at our geological industry, to be perfectly blunt, it's in decline, and we really need to start educating the next generations of geologists. And obviously we've got to start educating many underprivileged people who don't have opportunities to get out there and see some of these things. So the work that Wendy Taylor's doing in the Cape is also most important, with her puppet shows and getting out onto the Cape Flats.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Hayley. Good morning.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed that, especially the day before Heritage Day.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a profound question at all. I just wanted to say I was really privileged about 2 years back to have a little bit of a getaway on your family farm in Wellwood. And your sister-in-law, Marion, showed us the fossil collection, which was incredible to see. My question is actually a really, I guess, a bit of a silly one. I want to know, when did you find your first fossil? Like, how old were you when you started your career?
Well, I was lucky. I grew up with a fossil collection, and I was always fascinated by it. But one of my earliest recollections is my father was building a motor gate, a grid, and there was a bit of concrete lying there, which I thought was a fossil. And so I was 3 years old. I got onto my tricycle and I drove down to my grandfather's house, which was 2 miles away. And I handed him this thing and I said, "Grandpa, here's a fossil for you." And he didn't hand it back to me. He said, "Thank you very much for the fossil." And he then took it. And when I went down to him a couple of days later, he'd painted a face onto it, put teeth onto it and all of those sorts of things. Well, that was when I was about 3. But in the collection is a fossil skull that I discovered when I was 5 years old. Yeah, a flesh-eating animal, Organopsia. But I'm not a particularly good collector of fossils. I have a fantastic team of people working with me, and they discover fossils. And that person, John Naipuli, who worked with me from the National Museum, he was just outstanding. He had patience to just, in that area in the southern Karoo, all those beds are tilted, and so they're vertical. So you're looking at the edge of the strata. And so what you do is you follow out a layer. And if you find a bit of bone on it, it's just excellent at following out layers like that laterally over kilometers and kilometers. In the earlier years when we started collecting, John and I, and started finding stuff in the Ura-Sandown zone, our collecting average was 1 fossil a week. Now, to keep your enthusiasm going with 1 fossil a week is quite a tall order. But John was just amazing. He always just was out to find more. And so that's what led to the discovery of a totally new fauna, just that persistence and going out to see what we could find. Roger Smith used to come and visit me every time we went to the field. We coordinated our early field trips because we were doing our PhDs at the same time. And he called it the paleontological wastelands of South Africa. But John, I agree with you on this. You need to be educating younger people. And that is one of the things that I wanted to do here in Graaff-Reinet. Is to get schools involved and particularly to expose them to fossils. I also I do believe that fossils are an excellent way to bring people into science. Young people are fascinated by dinosaurs and prehistoric creatures. And I think that there's something that we can do there and use there to get people interested in science. And apart from that, it's a wonderful way of telling people about climate change, things like that. Extinction events are a wonderful way of introducing climate change, which we know is a reality now. It's just the ex-president of the United States never considered it a reality, but most other people do.
Bruce, in the evolutionary diagram that you showed us, there was a major split between those that became birds and lizards, etc., versus those that became mammals. This point was marked by skulls that had 2 cavities behind the eye sockets versus those that only had 1. As evolution progressed, there were many other branches. I assume many of those branches are also marked with certain characteristics in the fossil record. Is that so?
Now, you ask me a very tough question, which I can't answer, but I can only say you must remember that when we're dealing with fossils, there's a lot of characteristics that you can't see because there's no flesh. All you've got is the bone or the hard parts. And so you're reliant on those hard parts to lead you through. But now, for instance, when you were talking about those temporal openings, the openings at the back of the skull over here, the temporal openings, which in mammals have only 1, we've got 1, and it's where our jaw muscles come through and attach on top of our skull. So when you chew like this, you can feel your jaw muscles bulging here where my hands are, if you can see my face. That's because they're coming through my temporal opening and attaching on my skull roof. And I've only got 1 temporal opening. But now dinosaurs have 2, and all lizards, snakes, and crocodiles and birds. Tortoises appear to have none, no temporal openings. Because of the work on the fossils that we've done over here now, we find that that is actually a secondary thing, and we've looked at the embryology of tortoises also. That closing of that second temporal opening is a thing that happened later in their development. It was picked up from DNA studies that tortoises were more closely related to lizards than what previously thought. And then when the paleontologists started looking at that, they realized the fact that tortoises have a closed skull is a secondary characteristic. It's developed later. The primary situation in the embryonic form is to have 2 openings like lizards. I know I've digressed a little bit from your question, but I'm a little bit like a politician. I don't want to answer your question, so I'm answering another question.
I'm going to persist. There must be certain definitions all the way up the tree of life to show why one species branched off from another one. Surely there must be indications all the way up.
Why one species evolved from another one?
Yes, presumably in the fossil records, there must be some indications where it branched out into other types of animals.
You can see characteristics that suddenly start appearing in certain forms that weren't there previously. Those you can see, but the branchings are more difficult to actually define at what point they happen. And the only way you're going to do that is to find many more fossils. And we're only at the early stages of this whole exploration. You look in the hominid record now, we thought that it had been quite well sorted out. And then Lee Berger came along and found Homo naledi and Australopithecus sediba, which showed characteristics that because they were complete skeletons that had skulls and skeletons together. Up until then, people had looked at the skulls only or just the skeletons and come up with ideas. Then we got these characteristics appearing in the human record, which were not anticipated and just complicated the story much more. So the only way you're going to solve that is to find more fossils. And then to combine that with DNA studies, which are important, and to combine it with embryonic studies. Look at the embryology of an animal, because in an animal's embryonic development, it goes through the stages of its ancestors, if I can put it that way, in broad terms.
So you've got another
40
years, Bruce.
40 exciting years ahead.
Bruce, could I make a comment on the geoheritage thing that you mentioned? And I think it's very appropriate, and also the educational aspects. You probably heard of the Maconjwa Trail in Barberton. That is really based on some displays at particular sites of importance, and it's proved extremely popular as an educational place and as a tourist place and so on. And more of these things are being considered. Now, I just wondered, in the case of Kraafrenet, you could have your center that you're talking about, which is fantastic. What are the possibilities of having a trail where one could go and see some of these aspects, or even where the fossils were found or the scenery around about, get them out, having a look at the scenery, and maybe having an explanatory panorama or something like that, which would then, link in with the actual fossils that they see in your exhibit area, And you could also include other aspects. The scenery around Graaf-Reinet is obviously very important. I mean, for example, the Dollerite scenery, the Valley of Desolation, and or the Tuintjiesberg and the Kompasberg, etc. So you've got a plethora of very interesting scenery as well as fossils that you could expose people to. So I think they're good opportunities. And I think we might have discussed this before, but do you have anything like this in mind? I know that you do have a fossil tour where you take people along the river at New Bethesda and actually see bones sticking out of the river, which is quite impressive. Is there anything like that that you have in mind, Bruce?
Certainly, Richard, that is one of the things, one of the endpoints that we wanted to get to. And, you know, we've also got over here the in-Permian extinction, which Roger Smith has done so good work on around Lurtsburg Pass. So there's a story also, because that's the greatest extinction of all times. And then just south of Graaf-Reinet, there are other things like there's Dwika, there's Eka, there's also that Kalkkorp crater, which we can incorporate as well. So there's a lot that we can do. And you know, the Valley of Desolation is just a superlative of Dollarites. So there's a lot we can do.
Just one point on that. You don't have coal in the Eka, as far as I know. In your part of the world, except maybe Maltino, but yeah. Are there, for example, fossil Glossopteris there? I'm not sure, the equivalent of the coal measures up north. And could one also look at some plant fossils that were obviously pretty important in the Karoo for the development of coal, for example, in the Eka? I think that's quite as well, the development of plants. But I'm not sure if you do find plant fossils associated with any of your localities.
We do find plant fossils. They're not all that exciting to look at, but Rosie Previk from Albany Museum has got a fantastic site, which I wouldn't want to open to tourism because it's a very important scientific site at the top of the pass leading towards Craddock. Over there, she's got fantastic localities. There are localities where we can find plants and we can show them to tourists. So that is something that I'm also working on. And in fact, just around here in Graaf-Reinet, I've been getting people to help me, locals from here, to help me find stuff around town that I can try and set up a trail around Graaf-Reinet.
Obviously, there's saltpeter cop, and I think Mike DeWitt has been involved in some fossil, and obviously that's younger, but fossil trees that have been found associated with saltpeter cop.
Yeah.
And there's some great fossils, in the nearby conservation area as well around Sutherland. So, the sky's the limit, Richard, in terms of this amazing Karoo. We all think it's dusty and dirty and bloody hot, but it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. No, exactly. There's a lot that we can do in the Karoo around Sutherland. There's all of that stuff that Mike DeWitt is involved in. There are lots of fossils from Sutherland. There's also at the telescope, there's a little museum over there which shows fossils. At Fraserburg, which is not far away, there's that fantastic footprint site, a local person who offers tours to that. The biggest problem with showing fossils to people is that as soon as you turn your back, they take it away. So when you expose fossils to people, you've then got to put somebody in charge to look after them and then pay that person. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. You've got to have somebody there to look after the fossils before you've got the tourists. That was the fortuitous thing of what I set up in New Bethesda, was that because of the artwork of Helen Martins, New Bethesda already had a dedicated audience of 15,000 visitors a year. And so I piggybacked on that. And so we automatically had people coming to the fossils over there. And that's why it's been able to be a sustainable business without having to get external capital to keep it going. And even through this COVID period, we've kept it going just from gate takings.
We mustn't underestimate Prince Albert as well, too, and the ladies in their museum. I mean, that's another wonderful resource as well.
That is very true. Prince Albert's fantastic.
So you've got the makings of a really wonderful either 2 or 3 or 4 day trips, or shorter trips for passing through quickly.
That's something that the Paleontological Society has been dreaming to do, and I think that we're now at the stage that we need to do it. At Golden Gate, I spoke to the Department of Tourism years ago, and I managed to get money together with Sam Parks, and we've established, because that's where James Kitching found those earliest dinosaur eggs. They're the oldest dinosaur eggs in the world, and a nesting site where these dinosaurs used to go and roost every year. Jonah will no doubt talk about it next week. The building is now being built, but now they need to put the stuff into it, which is planned. So hopefully Sam Parks can now get that together to finally complete the project.
Fantastic. Anyway, thanks everyone. That was excellent. We really appreciate it, Bruce, and thanks for all the questions and discussions, and thanks for Gert and Henny's normal good admin and management of the weekly talks.